Good morning, everybody. This week we are talking about developmental and life course theories. Developmental or life course theories, they focus on the individual and following such individuals throughout life to examine their offending careers. This perspective puts a lot of emphasis on life events that are often referred to as transitions. Now, this significantly affects an individual's trajectory within criminal behavior. Life course perspectives emphasize such concepts as onset, frequency of offending, duration of offending, seriousness of offending, distance of offending, and other factors that play key roles in when individuals offend and why they even did so or why they did not do so. So at certain times in their lives, this can happen throughout their life from adolescence through adulthood. There are many critics of the developmental or life course perspective, particularly those who buy into the low self-control model. And this is anti-developmental in the sense that it assumes that propensities for crime do not change over time, but rather remain unchanged across life. And we're going to talk a lot more about this. One of the developmental models that have received the most attention is that from Sampson and Lobb. And this emphasizes transition in life that alter trajectories either toward or away from crime. And we're going to talk more about them specifically in a few slides. Now, Moffat's developmental theory of chronic offenders, she labeled life course persistent offenders. She labeled these chronic offenders as life course persistent offenders. And these are versus, her theory looked at these chronic offenders versus more normal offenders. And she labeled them adolescent limited offenders. Now, her focus is on the developmental model that has received the most attention over the last decade. And much of her research is supportive of the interactive effects of biology and environment combining to really create these chronic habitual offenders. Another key developmental theory is Thornberry's interactional model. Now, this emphasizes different types of influences of certain factors at different times of our development, as well as the reciprocal or feedback effects of certain outcome variables on previous antecedent factors. Now, this type of feedback loop can often result in a person being caught in a vicious cycle of criminality. Now, which can be very hard for that person to get out of. What I want to focus on in this presentation are the three types of developmental theories, as well as touch on more Sampson and Lobb, and then I want to end with discussion on the policy implications. So life course, latent trait, and trajectory life course theories are basically the idea where criminality is dynamic. Now, remember I said a few minutes ago some of the critics said that crime does not change. But these theories are that criminality is dynamic. It is not static. It's constantly changing and is influenced by individual characteristics, by traits, and by social experiences. So let's talk about some of the life course theories, like course concepts in general. This idea of changing life like influences, like if you have a disruption in a major transition point, like one of the life course concepts in this idea that can be a majorly destructive factor. So if something happens or if you have a major life transition and it doesn't go well, then this can promote criminality. And so people are influenced by different factors as they mature. In terms of who has influence on you, factors then that are relevant can affect your behavior. For example, in childhood, your parents are by far the most important influence. And once you hit adolescence, it becomes all about your peers, who are then the most important. And then as you become an adult, it might become all about your career. So if you have a major transition, maybe you're transitioning from childhood into adolescence, or or some specific thing, maybe that could lead to depression and substance dependence, and also something like moving or the death of somebody in your family, or there's a major transition and maybe it's not done very successfully or well, and then this can cause some major problems about criminality. But in general, we're talking about life course concepts. It's that idea that it's not always the same people who are going to influence us as we grow and as we change within our life. There are different people who will become the most important in determining how we behave. So once you're an adult, you know what your friends think of you is not that big a deal anymore as it was if you were an adolescence or a youth. They don't think that what I'm doing is good, or maybe they don't like me for whatever reason. Then I don't, I can decide, well, I don't really need them. But when you're an adolescent, that's a pretty important influence in your life. So things can change as you mature. There are some other specific life course concepts. One of them is what's called problem behavior syndrome. This is the idea that crime is one of many antisocial behaviors that kind of cluster together, and problem behaviors, they tend to co-occur. So the more problems in someone's life and the more problems that are attracted to that person, kind of the core problems are here, that we're going to have these problems. So these would be things like family dysfunction, sexual and physical abuse, substance abuse, smoking, any precocious sexuality, early pregnancy, educational underachievement, suicide attempts, sensation seeking, unemployment. So things like that, when you have more of these problems or issues like those that exist in a person's life, the more additional problems they're going to cause. So if you have something like you have problems in school and you know that caused you to act out, it may have caused you to skip class, and then when you skip class, maybe you started smoking, and then maybe then you also started doing other kinds of drugs or using alcohol because now you're not in school and you don't have that regiment. And then that can lead to basically feeling good. And then you're living in sort of the more problems that you've created, and the more problems that you have, the more problems that you're going to cause. And that's kind of the idea of this problem behavior syndrome. Then, so crime and committing crimes become one problem or behavior that exists among all these other problematic behaviors and all these other things that have happened in somebody's life. So this problem behavior syndrome is basically, as I said, problems beget more problems. Age is another life course concept in the sense that early onset of deviance strongly predicts later and more serious criminality. The earlier the onset, the longer and more serious the criminal behavior will be. And this is definitely supported in a lot of research that shows sort of that people as kids are doing things like fire setting. They may be bullied or become bullies. Maybe they're also going to one step further, or maybe they're committing acts of sexual deviance. When we're talking like really young ages, maybe 8, 9, 10, 11, 12. If you're doing things like this in those age ranges, then those people, now I'm not saying they're beyond help, but they are very at-risk children, and that they should be receiving a lot of attention by various institutions and especially their family. But these people so far are likely to have a longer criminal career and be more deviant in adolescence, more so than your typical adolescent, and that continues into adulthood. And these are the ones that also have the more serious criminal offending. So if you start earlier in your criminal career, it's not only going to be longer, but it's also going to be more serious offending, things like violence and sexual crimes. And desistance is another concept when people stop committing crimes. Now, this is a slow, gradual process. It's not something that matches. I'm saying that this state is how it involves changing the mindset and the identity of the offender so that they no longer consider themselves an offender. They change their thinking from being a current offender to an ex-offender or an ex-con, and that's really a gradual process. So changes will come from within that can be effective and be permanent. So the offender has to decide that they're not really a bad person. And this is actually what I have told the juvenile offenders that I worked with, that sexually offending doesn't make you a bad person. It's just that the things you have done are bad in the past. And so they don't need to do these offenses, these issues anymore. They may have to work towards changing one situation at a time. So it may be a start an overall process. And it starts with the general readiness to change, so that you will know that, for instance, leaving prison, is not a fun lifestyle. I wouldn't think so. And you would tell yourself, I don't want to do this anymore. I don't want to run from cops anymore. I think I need to change my life. So it may start with this idea that they want to change. And so they encounter one or more environmental hook. And this is what it's called, and it's a positive life experience. So somebody saying, I believe in you, could be a hook. Having a child with a major hook, or, as they get older, getting married or finding a good job, anything like that, where there's a positive life influence. It could be anything from somebody just saying something nice to you. It could be as you mature and have a baby with someone. It could be getting a new job at any time. It's anything that's a positive note. So it's a hook to get you into those good things that will come if you just get this shift in identity. So you're away from that idea that you're exiting the offender behavior, the offender thinking. So, and this is opposed to the current offender that may have to end that process of offending, and they have to maintain the positive identity, and then it will gradually decrease that desire for antisocial behavior. So at some point in their life, they're like, I don't even think about having the urge to commit more crimes anymore. And that is when true desistance happens. So it's not an instantaneous process. Like I said, it's a gradual process for somebody to truly just terminate their career of criminality. Life course theories in general are the much more integrated theories. And we're going to talk a lot more about integrated theories next week. They look at an onset, continuance, and assistance. So the factors that account for why somebody starts, and then why somebody continues a criminal career, and then finally why they desist. So clearly a career criminal, just from the face of it, there's a lot of interconnected factors. So we're looking at life course theories and looking at the personal factors of things like personality and intelligence. And these could play into social factors. Income, your neighborhood, socialization factors, parenting experiences, marriage, cognitive factors. This kind of information processes the existence of cognitive distortions or no cognitive distortions. And also you have situational factors that could be things like the opportunity to change, the amount of guardianship around an individual. It could be the area in which they live. And so life course theories sort of take all of these and say all of these above play a role at various stages in a person's life. And it may look different at different stages of life, but there are these roles and they're all relevant to explain criminal behavior, especially these lengthy criminal careers. And also, too, I want to mention the cognitive factors and the cognitive distortions. That is what we see in many criminals. And when I worked with the juvenile sex offenders, that's what we were teaching them, that they had these cognitive distortions that it was okay to do what they did, that it was okay to sexually offend someone. It was okay to make an excuse and do it again, because the therapy worked on changing those distortions and changing them to more positive influences. And when they could change those cognitive distortions, they could actually recognize their risk factors for offending. And so they trained themselves to stay away from those risk factors. So it became an automatic to them. So for instance, if they knew that if I go to a playground, I'm going to start to have those feelings because I'm going to see the type of victim that they have offended before. So they know I don't go to playgrounds, and especially don't go during these days of these hours of the day. And they train their brain so they don't even think about going to a playground during those hours, because they have changed their cognitive distortions. Age-graded theory. Now, this is a specific theory within the life course domain from Sampson and Lobb in 1993. And this is also discussed in your readings. But Sampson and Lobb came up with the age-graded theory. And basically, they talked about the fact there were various pathways to crime. And people have these pathways in which emphasizes transitions in life that alter trajectories either toward or away from crime. And that is something that's been well researched, but they wanted to know about the pathways back to conformity. And they were wondering, well, and either if we agree that there are various pathways for people to end up in the criminal lifestyle, and there has to be various ways to get out of it. So they then talked about trajectories, transitions, and turning points. So that trajectories are basically when you're on a various different pathway, and these can lead to various different transitions. For instance, important life events that can produce the transitions and then change the direction of a life course trajectory. So the trajectory is an overall pathway that you are on. So the transition is something that happens that can change the watch of trajectory you're on. So it can change the direction of your trajectory. And then the turning point itself is when somebody decides to turn and go on a different trajectory or path. So not all transitions will change the trajectory in a really significant way, but some transitions will actually create or even help create that turning point, so that both the transitions and trajectories can either be positive or negative, with positive or negative effects on the life course and on the behavior. Something else that Sampson and Lobb talk about is within the age-graded theory, and this was the importance of social capital. And social capital is basically positive relationships with individuals or institutions, and this very much influences the trajectory of a criminal career, because building the social capital supports conventional behavior, which then inhibits deviant behavior. So it could be things like marriage, it could be a career, it could be military service, really anything where the social capital is growing. And when it's growing, you're gaining these positive definitions and these positive relationships. And it could be with you just knowing the individual. That will be something like marriage. It could also be at the institutional level. So you, like, for instance, you got a new job, you start to serve in the military, you're gaining this positive social capital. With institutions, it could be whether it's your career and education, you're gaining social capital through the educational institution, or anything in the business area. It could be also anytime you're gaining this positive relationship, you're building social capital. And the more of this that you build, the more that's going to inhibit deviance, and then sort of lead somebody onto the path of desistance, and that they're not possibly already on now. And Sampson and Lobb, now they said that marriage was sort of the most important things in terms of increasing the likelihood of maturing out of crime. So they specified it's a successful marriage, but a successful marriage, and especially when there's kids involved, majorly increases the likelihood that dissidents and this is because marriage provides that structure, and it decreases opportunities because you can't always be out with the boys or always getting into trouble when you're married and have responsibilities, and you can't be out socializing with your delinquent peers. Even though as much as it may give you that sense of belonging and responsibility, because now you're a part of a family and they depend on you. It's also related to general aging and the slowing down process. Typically, people that get married, once they start to do that, they're already becoming mature. It's not always, but it is typical. And so it's related to that typically, because we know as people age, they are less likely to commit crimes. They age out of crime. I mean that this, really begs the question: does marriage increase that dissidence, or does a criminal decide he wants to change his life, and then both dissidence and marriage are part of the plan? Now that's really difficult to tease apart, but it's still the case, according to Sampson and Lobb, that marriage is very much linked to dissidence. So lastly, let's talk about the policy implications. Policy really needs to focus on prevention and intervention. So some of the implications of the developmental approach are really focused on early childhood and infancy. And so some of these policies emphasize the need to provide some universal care for pregnant mothers as well as their newborn children. Other policy implications along the same route include legally mandating interventions for mothers who are addicted to toxic substances, for instance, alcohol and drugs. Also, the assignment of caseworkers for high-risk infants in the community, and high-risk infants and children, such as those with birth or delivery complications. These interventions would really go a long way towards saving society from many problems, such as financial and victimization and trauma that can persist without such interventions or other types of interventions. Also, we need to be able to detect the early onset of problem behavior in children and youth, because this can increase to a more serious delinquent and criminal behavior that is associated with a long criminal career. Now, chronic offenders, they represent a very small group of offenders, but the most promising results in prevention falls on early family parent training and nurse home visitation programs for parents and children. So lastly, ultimately, a focus on the earliest stages of intervention will pay off the most and will provide the biggest bang for the buck.